And it starts streaming on Netflix on Friday, November 15th. The writer and director Sergio Pablos joins us today. I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby. And Sergio, the first question I want to ask is, how did you come about the idea of doing an origin story about Santa Claus?
Well, it was back in 2010 where I realized that there was all these slew of origin stories hitting the cinemas. We had like Batman Begins, but even like Hannibal Lecter and Jason were getting origin stories all of a sudden. I was like, well, that seems like an interesting premise. If I could take a character that was already established, I had all this mythology and lore, but maybe was outdated, or I could bring it to today's audiences. And I made a list of all the possible historical or literary characters that could lend themselves to it. And you could find names like Napoleon or Dracula or Joan of Arc in that list. And then I landed on Santa Claus, and I said, no. And I just kind of moved on, because at first I thought, well, this suggests a very corny story, and I don't think that's the one I want to do. But I just kept coming back to it. I was like, well, let me do some research on that. And I did look for origin stories for Santa Claus, and you find so many different iterations of it. There was the historical explanation, the religious explanation, the many traditions from all the different countries, and even some animated, classics I've done around that. But I thought there was room for one more, if I could find the non-corny version of it, that is. So I started playing around with the idea, and I figured if Santa Claus is not our main character in this film, but maybe a symbol for altruism, then we need a main character who needs to learn that lesson. And that's when Jesper the Postman was born. And I thought, well, that's an interesting combination, and I do all that. And usually stories come together for me when I find the irony. And the irony in this one was, what if everything that's good about Santa came about through the actions of the worst human being I can conceive of? And that kind of made it interesting for me. And I still saw that it had potential for comedy and heart and sincerity and drama. So I pretty much all the things I look for in a story to tell. And that's when I decided to move forward and try to make it into a film.
You talked about how when you landed on Santa Claus, your first instinct was that it was very corny. And I was wondering, beyond your view of the corniness of it, did you have any apprehension about doing a Christmas movie in general? Because it's area that has been that has been mined a lot already.
It has, but at the same time, one thing that I've learned when developing ideas is that you have to have that element that makes you want to tell a story, but you also have to find that commercial element that will allow you to sell the film. And in this case, I thought, well, having Christmas and Santa Claus being an integral part of the story is my commercial angle. If it was just a story about an old woodsman and a postman, and there was not Santa involved, it would have been so much more difficult to actually get it picked up, right? So I actually thought the Christmas thing was a positive. And then when we actually went out into the marketplace trying to sell this thing, we found otherwise. We found that a lot of people were very apprehensive about Christmas, especially theatrically speaking. Nobody wanted to come out in such a busy season against all the big films. So we actually realized that what we thought was a plus may have been a hindrance. It was only when we landed on Netflix that we actually discovered that they were actually actively looking for Christmas films. So that's what made it a perfect match for us.
We were talking earlier, and you were mentioning, and you clarified that this is your first feature as a writer and director. And I was wondering, what were some of the greatest challenges that you faced doing this sort of project for the first time?
Well, I didn't set off to be a writer in this. Actually, I had help too. I mean, we had two other very talented writers working with me on this. But I ended up being, in charge of writing for the most part, and that's something that terrified me for a long time. I never considered myself a writer. So, and also I'm writing in English, which is not my first language, and so I had to overcome a lot of fears in order to do that, but the more we went through it, the more I felt more comfortable with it, and the more I got help from a lot of people, including the voice cast, who was extremely useful in making sure that my writing was elevated. So I guess the writing was the biggest challenge for me. I had supervised in different capacities pretty much every other aspect of a film separately. I'd never taken a whole film together, but this was the first time. But at least I had experience in those fields. Writing, though, was a new thing for me.
One of the thing that sticks out the most about the movie is the very distinct animation style that seems to combine both 2D and 3D, and it's absolutely gorgeous to look at. How did you achieve that distinctive style of animation for this movie?
Well, I knew we wanted to do this in traditional animation because I've been looking for the right project to do that with for a long time. I feel strongly that 2D doesn't have to be completely gone because of the advent of 3D films. I think there's still a place for 2D films, but it had to be the right story that would actually benefit from the medium. But also we wanted to make sure we did not just lean on nostalgia alone. We wanted to make sure that we, like Disney used to do with every film, they used to push and come up with a new technological or artistic advancement in every film. And at some point, it simply stopped doing that. And I felt we needed to pick up where we left off. And okay, so if we were to, look for the next innovation, what would it be? And it seemed very obvious that integration was a big part of the limitations of 2D. You always felt like the characters didn't quite belong in the backgrounds. They were done with two different techniques, and they showed. And we realized that a big part of why that happened was because we couldn't use light in the same way we did in the backgrounds on the characters. So we focused on making sure we developed tools to make sure the characters would be bathed by the same light as the environments. And that took a while to figure out. But it turns out the best solution for that was, instead of looking for a technological automatic advancement, it was better to develop a tool for artists to use. So we actually recruited for our lighting team people who are very knowledgeable how to paint light. So a lot of concept designers, a lot of visual development artists that already know the language of painting light. And we just gave them a tool that allowed them to do the same thing on moving images. And what I love about that is that same imperfection of the human hand that goes into the drawing now travels all the way through the lighting as well. So what you're seeing is not something that attempts to be real, but something that attempts to be an artistic depiction of reality, something that's believable. It's not perfect. It's the search for appeal as opposed to the search for realism. And I think the ultimate goal was to try to make this look as if a piece of visual development artwork had come to life, or a storybook. Some people confuse it with 3D because it looks, that volumetric lighting reminds them of 3D, but that was not the goal. It was more of a side effect of what we're trying to do. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And actually, so you mentioned that you have and you already had the preference for 2D, but I was wondering, what were some of the other advantages that you found in doing this movie in that kind of style, as opposed to 3D or CG? Right.
Well, any film starts with art. So even 3D films, they do a lot of artwork, of how the style should be. And then the goal is to replicate that as you put it through the medium of 3D. That can be successful, but it's definitely hard work because you're trying to force the computer to do things it doesn't do naturally, right? It is possible to do, but it feels like for people like us, people who love to draw and paint, our path is different. We turn to find solutions within ourselves. If something doesn't work, you draw it better, you paint it better, right? You don't depend so much on technical solutions. So allowing the final art from the background painters to be on screen means that it's not adulterated through that process. You see what the artist intended all the way, and doing the same thing with the characters and integrating that. it really felt like the right approach, you know. So you do have advantages, you do have disadvantages. There's things that 3D is better at, and we used aid of CGI when needed. I mean, there's 5 reindeers pulling on this sleigh for a good portion of the film, so we generate those reindeers in 3D. Oftentimes, sometimes we would switch between 2D and 3D whenever needed. We were very pragmatical about it. What's gonna look great and get us there sooner was the goal. So there's definitely CGI in the film, but we were looking for pretty much every trick in the book. Does this environment need to be 3D, or can we get away with a good old-fashioned, you know, multi-plane camera solution, or do we do camera projection, or do we build a 3D set if we feel like we need the full range of motion for the camera? So it was a case-by-case situation. But there's things to these good, like we have no limitations on number of characters, for example. You know, like if 3D, you have a limitation. Like how many characters can you rig and prepare for a film, you know? And when you do a rig, you cannot put the same amount of detail into the rig for an incidental character as you put in a main character. In 2D, you can design a character in the morning and have it be animated in the afternoon, and it doesn't have to be any less detail or compelling than any other character. So there are advantages. The trick is to find a story that actually takes advantage of those advantages, if I may be redundant like that.
I'm curious though. For future projects, do you hope to stay within the 2D realm, or is CG something that you would want to work with in a future project?
Well, we used to never close ourselves up to anything, and before starting Klaus, we had a couple of CG projects in the lineup. I always felt that you find the right story, and then you find the right medium, and then you do it. But the thing, as we made Klaus, we discovered we never found that there was anything we couldn't do. We were not limited by the choice. So we are now much of the opinion that, or house style, or what makes us different is the usage of 2D and how we're trying to push the medium forward. So we're very much focusing our next efforts in 2D alone.
You mentioned earlier the amazing cast in this film. It is an amazing cast of Jason Schwartzman, J.K. Simmons, Will Sasso, Joan Cusack, Rashida Jones. Just a fantastic cast. How did you go about casting this movie?
Well, Netflix provided us with a great team of casting directors who helped us through it. And the first one was, the first list we got from them was their suggestions for Klaus. And on the Klaus character casting sheet, there were like 7 to 10 different names. On top of the list, it was J.K. Simmons, and I just said, yes, please. And I just didn't even look at the others. So I was like, if you can get J.K., that's all we need. So, and then he said yes, and we're off to a great start. I mean, we got the perfect guy, you know, for these characters, because we needed that range of a character that went from being kind of intimidating to being warm. And we needed the transformation, because this is a story about how this guy became Santa. So he doesn't start out the way you would expect him to. And he was perfect for that. Then the second casting that we got was Rashida, and I've been a big fan of hers for a long time. But Rashida had the added benefit that she's also a writer. So she would help me plus the material every time. She was great about that, right? And then Jesper took longer to figure out. Jesper was a tricky one, because I've been involved in films where we had a flawed main character, and it's very easy to fall into that trap where in making him flawed, you make him unlikable. It's very easy to fall into that. And so I was keenly aware of that. So the trick was to find somebody who could be flawed and reprehensible at the same time. He had to be likable. And it was Jason Schwartzman who came in and who worked with me, and we had a couple of sessions. We tried a few different things. He came in with like clips on his laptop. I could play like this, I could play like that. We tried a few things, but it was ultimately him who found that sweet spot. And I realized after recording with him and figuring that out, when I went back to writing, I was able to write his version of the character, which helped me immensely in moving the story forward, but it was all credit goes to Jason. And also he's the kind of guy that will improvise the heck out of everything I give him. So a 2-word line could easily turn into a 20-minute rant. And that's great because that gives us so much to choose from. And you can also have the added benefit of having a character who can feel his thinking, because Jason is literally coming up with his lines on the fly. So he's searching for the words, and that comes across in a very natural way in animation.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Sergio. We wish you all the best this award season. And to our viewers, make sure you click subscribe to see all our interviews and go to goldderby.com to make your predictions and see if you can outsmart the biggest prognosticators in Hollywood. Again, thanks so much, Sergio.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.